Anne Frank. She was 13 years old when she and her family went into hiding from the Nazis. Though she did not survive, the diary she kept did. Her words would give voice to millions. By Kristen Lewis. It was early morning, and 13-year-old Anne Frank was hurrying down the street with her parents. Warm summer rain was pouring down steadily. Despite the mild temperature, Anne was wearing 2 vests, 3 pairs of pants, a dress, a skirt, a jacket, a scarf, 2 pairs of stockings, a cap, and a coat. Anne felt hot and uncomfortable wearing so many clothes, but she kept that to herself. This was a life-or-death moment for her and her family, and Anne knew it. It was July 6, 1942, in Amsterdam, a city in the Netherlands. Because they were Jewish, the Franks were in grave danger. They had made the tough decision to go into hiding, to disappear without a trace. So despite their terror, Anne and her family had to pretend they were simply out for a stroll. They had to wear all their clothing because carrying suitcases would have seemed suspicious. If anyone discovered what they were doing, they could be arrested and killed. A terrifying regime. Though Anne lived more than 75 years ago, in some ways she may not have been so different from you. Anne dreamed of going to Hollywood. She decorated her room with photos of glamorous movie stars. She worried about her crushes and dreaded math. But this ordinary girl had been swept up in an extraordinarily evil chapter in human history. Anne lived during the time of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, one of the most horrific regimes the world has ever seen. Hitler's rise to power started before Anne was born. After Germany lost World War I in 1918, its economy fell apart. Jobs became scarce. Anger and bitterness swept the country. Hitler, a rising German politician, offered a scapegoat: Jewish people. Hitler said that Jewish people were to blame for Germany's problems, and that they did not deserve to live. Anti-Semitism, prejudice against Jewish people, had been ingrained in European culture for centuries. Jewish customs and beliefs were often viewed with suspicion and contempt. Hitler fanned the flames of these age-old prejudices until they exploded into violent hatred. The Franks had lived peacefully in Germany for generations. With Hitler in power, however, life became dangerous. So in 1933, when Anne was 4, her father, Otto Frank, decided to move the family to Amsterdam. The beautiful Dutch city of winding streets and canals seemed like a good choice. The family had every reason to believe they would be safe there. And for 6 years they were. Otto worked hard to make his business successful. He owned a company that made pectin, an ingredient in jelly. Anne and her older sister Margot made many friends at school. Hitler and his Nazis seemed like faraway monsters. Until May 1940, when Nazi forces invaded the Netherlands. The invasion. After the invasion, life for Jewish people became a nightmare. The Nazis put laws in place to isolate Jewish people and strip them of their rights. Anne and Margot were expelled from their school. All Jewish people were banned from buses, trains, and cars. They couldn't go to the movies. They couldn't be outside past 8 p.m. And they had to wear yellow stars so the Nazis could easily identify them. Then, people started to vanish. Later, there would be whispers about concentration camps, horrific places where Nazis were holding Jewish people captive and forcing them to work. And of death camps, where Nazis were systematically murdering Jewish people. Many refused to believe that even the Nazis could be so evil, but Anne's parents, especially Otto, had no doubt that staying in Amsterdam would mean certain death for the family. By 1942, Jewish people in Nazi-occupied countries were not allowed to travel. Even if travel had been permitted, safer countries like the US and England were admitting only a very small number of Jewish people. What's more, Germany had seized control of so much of Europe that for hundreds of miles there was no place a Jewish person could go without the risk of being killed. The Franks were trapped. So Anne's father came up with another idea. They would hide. The main building of Otto's pectin business contained offices and a warehouse. Behind it was a smaller building, an annex, that could be reached only from inside. It seemed the perfect place for the Franks to hide until the war was over. A small group of Otto's employees agreed to help, despite the risk. Assisting Jewish people was against the law and punishable by imprisonment, or even execution. It was to the annex that the Franks, dressed in their many layers of clothing, were fleeing that July morning in 1942. Living in fear. Anne had no idea that her father and some of his employees had spent months preparing for her family to go into hiding. They had stocked the annex with food, dishes, bedding, and other necessities. Otto had even brought some of Anne's photos from her old bedroom. A week after the Franks arrived, they were joined by Otto's business partner, Herman van Pels, along with van Pels's wife, August, and their 15-year-old son, Peter. A dentist named Fritz Pfeffer came 4 months later. In total, 8 people hid in the annex. It was a small maze of rooms, stairs, and hallways that might have been comfortable for one small family, but it was cramped for such a large group. Meanwhile, business in the warehouse went on as usual. Other than the helpers, employees had no idea that 8 people were hiding just a few feet away. Anne and the others in the annex spoke in whispers and tiptoed around. They didn't dare flush the toilet too often or open a window, even on the most sweltering days. The smallest noise, a cough, a chuckle, a dropped dish, could give them away. The SS, the Nazis' ruthless military unit, would give a cash reward to anyone who turned in a Jewish person. Fragile hope. Living in such close quarters was a challenge, especially for the energetic Anne, who yearned to run outside and feel the sun on her face. Her one comfort was her diary, her most prized possession. It was only in the pages of her diary that she could freely vent her feelings and frustrations. "I'm longing, so longing for everything," Anne wrote in one entry. "To talk, for freedom, for friends, to be alone, and I do so long to cry." And yet life went on. The residents of the annex fell into a routine. Every morning, they had breakfast at 9. During the day, Margot, Peter, and Anne did schoolwork. Lunch was served at 1:15 when the employees in the warehouse went home to eat. In the evenings, Anne and the others ate dinner gathered around the radio, eagerly listening to the daily news broadcasts from Great Britain. When the helpers snuck into the annex with food and other provisions, they brought grim news of the outside world. World War II was raging across Europe. Many of the Jewish families the Franks knew had been taken away by the Nazis. People were starving. Bombs were falling mere blocks away. Anne could often hear rapid-fire shooting on the street outside the annex. Yet there was hope as well. The Allies, led by Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, were fighting Hitler. The Soviet Union was a group of republics controlled by Russia from 1921 to 1991. The residents of the annex told each other it was only a matter of time before the Allies drove the Nazis out of the Netherlands, before they could leave the annex and be free. But weeks of waiting turned into months, and months turned into years. My courage is reborn. Anne would live in the annex for more than 2 years. During that time, she recorded in sharp and frequently funny detail everything that went on. The modest dinners cobbled together from rotting potatoes, her fights with Auguste Van Pels, the challenge of finding enough privacy to take a sponge bath. The annex did not have a bathtub. In her beautiful looping cursive, Anne wrote that she wanted her life to have meaning. She vowed to become a famous writer, with her first book to be based on her now overflowing diary. She went back to old entries, revising and rewriting. "I can shake off everything if I write," Anne wrote in April 1944. "My sorrows disappear. My courage is reborn." Then came catastrophe. Betrayed. In August 1944, Dutch police, led by an SS officer, forced their way into the annex and dragged everyone away at gunpoint. Someone had betrayed the Franks. After the officers were gone, 2 helpers, Miep Gies and Bep Volkskuil, crept into the annex, their hearts heavy. The officers had ransacked the place and stolen anything they thought held value. But in fact, they had left behind something of enormous value. Strewn across the floor of the attic were the pages of Anne's diary. The women gathered them up. Miep told herself that she would keep them safe, locked away in her desk, and return them to Anne after the war, when the nightmare was finally over. Something precious. The fighting in Europe would come to an end 9 months later, in May 1945, when the Nazis were at last defeated. By then, the Nazis had murdered an estimated 6 million Jewish people. This genocide came to be known as the Holocaust. Otto Frank was rescued from a death camp called Auschwitz in Poland. He was gravely ill and emaciated from months of hard labor and starvation. He had no idea where his family was. During his months-long journey back to a battle-scarred Amsterdam, Otto learned that his wife, Edith, had been killed at Auschwitz. But the whereabouts of Margot and Anne were unknown. Otto held out hope that they had survived. Otto was staying with Miep Gies and her husband in Amsterdam when he finally received a letter containing news of his daughters. Anne and Margot had both died at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. The girls had died of the disease typhus just weeks before the camp was liberated by the British Army. Otto handed the letter to Miep. After reading it, she stood up and opened the drawer of her desk. She had something to give him, something precious, Anne's diary. Miep told Otto that out of respect for Anne, she had not read a word of it. Now Anne's words belonged to him. Sharing her words. Otto decided to honor Anne's wish and share her words with the world. First published in 1947, The Diary of a Young Girl has since been translated into some 70 languages. It is one of the most read books in the world. "If God lets me live, I shall not remain insignificant," Anne wrote in April 1944, a few months before the officers stormed the annex. "I shall work in the world and for mankind." And that is exactly what she has done. Her diary has given voice to those silenced by the Holocaust. She has inspired millions of people with her courage and honesty, and with her refusal to give up hope during one of history's darkest times. In this way, Anne's wish came true. Through her diary, Anne Frank will never be forgotten.